Good morning. It's Wednesday, March 5th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 516 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Well, it turns out Donald Trump's Gaza plan did exactly what we thought it might do. The disruptor in chief threw out a plan that wasn't really a plan, and then told the Arabs that if they didn't like his non-plan, they should come up with a plan of their own. So that's what they've done. Egypt has just floated a $53 billion plan to be implemented over 5 years. I think it's ambitious, but the real problem is that it doesn't solve for the problem of Hamas. The terrorist group simply cannot remain in Gaza if the goal is to turn a corner in this coastal enclave of the Mediterranean. So we're going to keep watching this space, but I'm glad to see the beginning of a dialogue, if we can call it that. Our guest today is the talented filmmaker Wendy Sachs, whose latest project, October 8, is a documentary about the rise in anti-Semitism on university campuses following the Hamas attacks of October 7th in 2023. The film features the likes of Barry Weiss, Noah Tishby, Deborah Messing, and yours truly. If you've had enough of me already, I definitely get it. But don't worry, other smarter and prettier people get lots of screen time in this film, including a number of Morning Brief guests, by the way. I highly recommend giving this film a watch. While it hasn't officially been released to the public yet, I believe it's coming out in about a week and a half. We'll be sharing a trailer with you shortly, so stay tuned for that in just a few minutes. Okay, fine. I admit it. I worry about a return to war in Gaza, not just because the ceasefire has freed up my schedule a little bit. That's been nice. But no, my problem is that I can't predict what happens if the fighting returns. We know that the Houthis are already ready to rumble. They have said as much, and they have their itchy fingers on the ballistic missile trigger. Sure, the Israelis have done a good job of knocking those missiles out of the sky until now, but how many Arrow interceptors are left? Nobody I talk to will tell me. Will Hezbollah get back into the act? They still have 50,000 or more projectiles and thousands of fighters. They are undeniably weaker than they were, but they may just be strong enough to give it another go. The West Bank also concerns me. There's a lot more terror activity there right now than a few months ago. Could we see a major escalation? Iran is weak after Israel knocked out its air defenses, but the regime still has a few thousand ballistic missiles, and it might yet try to make a dash for a nuke. So no, Hamas is not really my concern. It's all the other fronts that worry me if the Gaza fighting returns. I'm sure Israel has plans, and I'm sure they are well thought out. But as I have said before, wars only produce one thing consistently, and that's unintended consequences. What surprises await us if the ceasefire collapses? We may soon find out. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, the State Department designated the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, or maybe I should say redesignated the Houthis. President Donald Trump added the Houthis to the FTO list days before leaving office in January 2021. That lasted all of a few weeks before President Biden came in and took the Houthis off the list. I think it's safe to say that Biden would go on to regret that move because after Hamas's October 7th attack, the Houthis began targeting U.S. Navy ships and commercial vessels in the Red Sea, wreaking havoc on global trade. You'd think that would have landed the Houthis back on the terror list, but no, all the Biden administration did was designate the Iran-backed rebels as specially designated global terrorists, SDGTs, a label that has less legal authority and is typically issued in tandem with an FTO designation. That's a lot of bureaucracy, but bottom line, fast forward to yesterday, and the State Department has put the Houthis back on the blacklist that they should have been on all along. Headline 2, Russian missile experts traveled to Iran twice last year. This may sound kind of benign or even boring, but it is potentially huge. Reuters reviewed travel records and found that 7 Russian experts were booked on flights from Moscow to Tehran on April 24th and September 17th, 2024. The April flight was just 10 days after Iran launched its first ever direct missile attack against Israel. And the September flight was 2 weeks before Iran's second direct attack. The travel records include the Russians' passport numbers. 6 of them started with the number 20, which means that the passport was being used for official state business. Reuters also reviewed employment data, which indicated that all 7 travelers have senior military backgrounds. 2 are air defense missile experts. 3 are artillery and rocket gurus, and the others have backgrounds in weapons development and missile testing. When contacted by Reuters, the men denied traveling to Iran, working for the military, or both. I don't like any of this. I think it shows a clear connection between the Russian regime and the Iranians and their plans to attack Israel. But I got to tell you what I really don't like. I really don't like the reports in recent days that Vladimir Putin wants to help the United States negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran. That is insane. Headline 3, Turkey and Iran are at loggerheads. Pass the popcorn. It started on Friday when an interview with Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan aired on Al Jazeera, the Qatari-owned vitriolic television station. During that segment, Fidan said Iran's proxy strategy is risky and that Tehran should change its approach to the region. Tehran wasn't happy. A spokesman for the regime said that Fidan's remarks were, quote, unconstructive. Wow, that's harsh. And that it shouldn't happen again. Then on Monday, a senior aide to the Iranian foreign minister ripped into the Turkish ambassador, who was told to refrain from inappropriate comments that could drive a wedge between Tehran and Ankara, and to focus his efforts on hammering Israel. I guess they can agree on that. Turkey reciprocated by chewing out Iran's envoy. For the record, this is the kind of Middle East conflict I can definitely appreciate and get behind. More, please. All right, it's time for that interview with Wendy Sachs. As I mentioned, she has an upcoming film, October 8, which explores the surge in anti-Semitism on U.S. campuses and beyond following the Hamas massacre of October 7, 2023. Before I welcome her onto the show, I'd like to play the trailer for the film to kick off our discussion. So sit back, relax, and watch.
The terrorist group Hamas has attacked Israel in the air, on the ground, and in the sea.
The second I understood the depravity of what happened and the barbarism,
they've kidnapped Israelis, including children.
I thought that the entire globe would be in mourning. And not only was it silent, there was jubilation.
It was exhilarating. It was energizing.
I wasn't seeing an ideological disagreement. I was seeing hatred.
Free Palestine!
The hate started flooding in almost immediately.
Students called it resistance. They called it justified. They began calling Zionist students racist.
We are Hamas! Standing up for being Jewish got me more hate than all the things that I have said on social media and on my podcast combined. And I've said a lot.
For every one video that is pro-Israeli, there's 54 pro-Hamas and pro-Palestine videos, sir.
Foreign state and non-state actors are seeding the online space with false narratives in order to impact the stability of Western democracy.
30 years ago, leaders of Hamas in America met and discussed strategy to hijack students' minds.
Israel,
adapting the concept of intifada. Violence will follow.
Down with the USA! Down with the USA!
This is not about Jews. This is about democracy. This is about human decency.
What does it mean that the future leaders of the most important democracy in the world are chanting for intifada? What is the country going to look like a decade from now?
What is at stake is the soul of America.
Welcome to the FDD Morning Brief, Wendy Sachs.
Thank you so much, John. It's great to be here, and what a great kickoff for the morning. The trailer, it still sends shivers down my spine. It's pretty powerful.
It is indeed. All right. Well, I want to start with the basics of this. Why did you decide to make this film?
I mean, listen, I was visiting my daughter, Lexi, at the University of Wisconsin in Madison on October 7th, 2023. It was game day. It was a Saturday morning, and I have the Rocket Alert app on my phone, and my phone was blowing up with attacks on Israel. And we were watching the images come in of babies and children and young people and grandparents being murdered and being kidnapped into Gaza. And I think, like all of us, we were watching these images and it was as if a generational trauma was unleashed. But really, it was on October 8th when we saw what was happening in Times Square, where Hamas was being celebrated as freedom fighters rather than as terrorists. And then we saw what was happening at Harvard with more than 30 student groups signing on to a letter blaming Israel on the attack on itself. And then we saw campus after campus with these protests. And again, it was like the world had lost its mind. And I couldn't believe what we were seeing. And I felt like I just needed to document the moment.
And you have, and I've seen the film, and I think it's terrific. It's actually amazing, all the different elements that you brought into the film. But I do want to ask you about one person in particular. You have Deborah Messing that's featured in the film, but she's also the executive producer. She's a legend in Hollywood. So how did you end up making that connection, that partnership with Deborah Messing?
Listen, that's a great question. Deborah, I did not know Deborah before this film. I was watching what she was putting out on Instagram, and she was so unapologetic in calling out the hypocrisy and calling out the hate and saying, you know, where is the world? Where is Hollywood? There are hostages. There are innocent people. There are Jews, and by the way, it's not just Jews who were kidnapped and murdered on October 7th. And she said, where is everyone on this? And she was doubling down. And I thought, wow, she's a voice of moral clarity and I want to connect with her. So honestly, I just, as the kids say, I slid into her DM on Instagram and I started gently stalking her and trying to find a mutual connection. And eventually, we had a Zoom and I asked her if not only could I interview her for the film, but would she want to come on board as an executive producer? I knew by bringing her in, it could really help elevate the project. And it really did. And this is the first documentary that she's been a part of in this kind of way. And it's been an incredible experience having her on board. And she continues to really use her voice to speak out against the hate and to, you know, speak for Jews and for Israelis. You know, what's interesting is she had never been to Israel until after October 7th. So that to me was pretty extraordinary. You know, she grew up with parents who were Zionists, and you know she was visibly Jewish, and she went to Brandeis University, but you know she just had never made it to Israel. It was always one of those, oh, it's a little too unsafe to go right now, kind of that was her experience. And then after October 7th, she took a trip there, which was really transformative. I wound up interviewing her for the film after she came back from Israel.
Amazing. Just for other folks to know, who else is in the film, names that might be recognizable, household names, Hollywood names, etc.
It really is a who's who list. But I do want to say, I didn't only want to interview Jewish people for this film. It was very important to me that we had a diversity of voices on both sides of the aisle, but also non-Jews. I wanted to make sure that this film is not just for the Jewish echo chamber, that's really for a global audience. But with that said, the who's who's list is Sheryl Sandberg and Scott Galloway, Mossab Youssef, who's the son of the co-founder of Hamas, Noah Tishby, Einat Wilf, Dan Senor, Congressman Richie Torres, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, just extraordinary people. Lorenzo Vidino, he's the head of extremism at GW University, Asafra Moravsky, some really, really smart thinkers who are deeply engaged in all aspects of this, from the Middle East to social media, and who really sort of elevate this film also. And you, of course, John, you are fantastic in the film, and really you help really connect the dots for us about Hamas in America and how long they have been seeding their messaging and how sophisticated they are and where the funding is coming from.
It's all obviously very scary. I was honored to take part in it. So let me just ask you, what has the response been to the film so far? The good and the bad. You've been traveling all over creation and sharing the film. I'm assuming you've got a lot of people who are cheering it, but probably a few people that are jeering it too. Yeah.
Listen, I think that the response has been honestly tremendous. We have done screenings from Miami to Mexico City, New York, LA, San Francisco, Park City, Utah, Chicago, college campuses. And the response has been incredible. Particularly, I would say, we have different audiences. We have the Jewish audiences and the non-Jewish audiences, and both are really responding. I think for Jewish audiences, it's affirming to see what's been going on and to understand and to feel inspired by the young people in the film. We have students in the film who are absolutely tremendous, who have they are courageous, they are well-spoken, but you listen to their harrowing stories and you just have so much respect for what they're going through and how they're standing up for their identity. But for the non-Jewish audiences, I would say it's really eye-opening. One of the themes of this film is that anti-Semitism has mutated over time, and the latest mutation of that is anti-Zionism. So we are unpacking that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And I think that's a really interesting a theme for people who are particularly non-Jewish to understand, like, what is Zionism actually, and how has that been hijacked in today's world, in our culture, and on college campuses, and is really manifesting an anti-Semitism. I say this now, we're going into theaters on March 14th. So far, I haven't really seen it hasn't gotten too hot. We haven't had too many protests. There's some noise out there, but it hasn't been overwhelming. But what I will tell you is getting this film made and the resistance in Hollywood to making this film, that's a whole other conversation. And what's been happening in the independent film community, and even getting representation for this project, that's where I've seen the fear factor of Hollywood wanting to really jump in.
Yeah, and we hear a lot about the battle that's going on in Hollywood right now. Kind of surprising, especially as everybody always says Jews control Hollywood. Certainly doesn't look that way right now. But okay, what surprised you as you made this movie? I mean, I assume you probably learned a ton. You listened to experts talk for hours about the war in the Middle East and the history leading up to all of this. So what were maybe one or two things where you kind of walked away going, wow, didn't think of that?
SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. I think, like many people, I thought it was just another student group. I thought of it was like, Students for Climate Change or Students for Reproductive Freedom. I didn't understand that they are really an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, that they're really an arm of Hamas in America. And we, not to give away the film, but there is this incredible moment in the film that we uncovered after we interviewed Lorenzo Vadino from GW University. And he talks about a meeting that took place at a Marriott hotel in 1993 in Philadelphia. And there's an FBI wiretap, and we actually found that wiretap, and we play it in the film. And you hear Hamas operatives in America talking about how to create messaging that's going to be more palatable to an American audience. So when they speak to people on the left, they're going to frame it in terms of apartheid and genocide and colonialism. And when they speak to people on the right, they're going to frame it in terms of patriotism. So already, more than 30 years ago, they were figuring out a game plan about how to infiltrate America. And they were talking about specifically going to universities and going into media institutions. That's how they were going to start co-opting the American culture and ideas around Hamas and around, what they were trying to achieve here. It was very strategic. They've been playing the long game. So what we saw on then October 8th, as there was a toolkit, a Hamas toolkit that was pushed out to universities and pushed out to SJP chapters around the country. This was not an accident. This was 30 years in the making. And I think that level of connecting the dots, which you've done, John, and you've shown this to Congress on multiple occasions. And we actually turned to you as an expert, and we used, some of your charts that you actually submitted to the congressional record a few times, and we created our own graphics around that. It showed actually the family tree of sorts between Hamas and to Iran, Islamic jihadism, and SJP on American campuses. And I think that is a big reveal in the film that blows people's minds and really surprised me as well.
I'm glad you did it. Couldn't be prouder to have contributed. We're running out of time. Last question before I let you go. What's next? What's your next project?
Well, thank you for that question. The next project is almost a follow-up, a part 2 to this project. We're calling it Poison Ivy, and it's a deep dive into what's happening in academia. You know, that what we talk about in this first film on October 8th is how did we get to this moment where Hamas is being celebrated as freedom fighters rather than as terrorists? And now I really want to expose how that has seeped into academia, not just on the college campuses, but also in K through 12. And it's about the funding that's coming from the Saudis and coming from Qatar and coming from China and all the foreign funding, but it's more than that. And we're really going to lift the hood up as to how we got to this in academia today.
Well, just FYI, FDD has a new program on education and national security. We'll be very happy to contribute to that. Wendy Sachs, want to thank you for joining us this morning on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Definitely encourage you to catch that movie on March 14th. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD's Ahmad Sharawi has a piece in The Hill outlining how he believes Arab leaders should respond to Trump's Gaza Lago plan if they don't like what the president floated. Following the Arab League's emergency summit in Cairo yesterday, Ahmed emphasizes that alternative plans must prioritize removing any semblance of Hamas from Gaza's future. My colleague Jonathan Conricus appeared on Vivian Berkovici's State of Tel Aviv podcast to discuss the current dilemma facing Israel, whether to prioritize freeing hostages or to prioritize destroying Hamas. I highly encourage you to listen to his insightful analysis, available wherever you get your podcasts. Finally, my colleague Bill Roggio penned a piece in FDD's Long War Journal on the recent U.S. airstrike that eliminated the senior military commander of al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, Huras al-Din, marking the 4th such strike against the group since Trump resumed his presidential duties. And if you have the time and inclination, at 2 p.m. Eastern today, I will be testifying before the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Europe about my least favorite NATO ally. Spoiler alert, it's highly unlikely that Ankara will be pleased with what I have to say. All right, that's enough hot air from me for now. If you're craving more, check out the expert analysis from our experts on our website, FDD.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, or take a peek at our Instagram and YouTube channels. And do feel free to make that generous tax-deductible donation at FDD.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another fascinating episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.